Okay. All right, let's get started. Anyone that's watching, this meeting is being recorded. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Tai, and I am the Executive Vice President for Finance for your Student Government Association. At TWU, we are committed to protecting the rights of free speech for members of our community, while knowing that those outside of our community are also have the right to express their opinions on our campus. The #1 goal for our campus is for each student to have a voice and to find opportunities to voice their opinion while feeling safe and protected at the same time. Over the past few months, we have witnessed numerous individuals feel oppressed while voicing their opinions, and whether we agree or disagree with the message, our role is to provide an outlet for students to express the rights of free speech at TWU. Over the past few months, TWU has been working hard to develop a new free speech policy for our campus. That charge has been led by Dr. Stephanie Kraut, Associate Vice President for Student Engagement. The Student Government Association has invited Dr. Kraut to join us this afternoon as we share our new free speech policy in ways which you can find your own voice on our campus through expression. Dr. Kraut, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, SGA, for inviting me. Yes, we've seen lots of new developments in terms of free speech, both nationwide as part of a national conversation. We have an interesting election looming ahead, but also across the state of Texas. And I'm going to hint on that a little bit and how it's impacted our particular practices at TWU in my presentation. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Elizabeth, can we see this okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay. So today we're going to, my presentation is going to consist quite a bit about the free speech part, but then we're going to go into social activism, in particular student activism, and maybe some tips and hints about how to do that on our campus. Because like Elizabeth said, and I totally agree, one of our biggest goals at TWU is to develop leaders, and leaders need to have a voice. And we want to help you find your voice on our campus and know that and feel comfortable that you can exercise your voice without fear of, I think, retaliation or concern that somehow it's going to impact you in a negative way, or, to use air quotes, get you in trouble. We want to kind of stay away from that and talk about using your voice in a great way and how to do that well on our campus. So we're going to go over some free speech basics. I'm going to talk a little bit about Texas state law and some changes, especially during the last legislative session, how that's kind of impacted our own free speech policy. And then we're going to definitely talk about the student activism piece. So I have to start off on the barest foundation. Free speech is a fundamental American freedom and a human right, and there's no place where that right is more valued and protected or important than institutions of higher education. Whether you think of your university experience as kind of a marketplace of ideas, or you came to be enrolled at TWU in order to get exposed to new and different things, or if you're just kind of going through that very typical college student experience of, I'm trying to figure out what I believe in. I know what my family believes in and what I was brought up with and what it was like during high school, but I still haven't gotten my head around what I believe in. That's higher ed's a perfect time and a perfect place to do that. And that's why it's so important for different ideas to be widely and freely expressed as part of a college or university experience. Kind of think about those kinds of things and make them your own. So with that, we have the First Amendment, and you hear First Amendment, that term, all the time. But in particular, it's really stated as it's just prohibiting the United States Congress from making laws that would prohibit, like the free exercise of religion, freedom of speech, would infringe on maybe freedom of the press, would inhibit your right to peacefully assemble. Even just going to the government for grievances. It's just saying Congress can't do anything that would prohibit it. And the way it kind of applies to states is not actually through the First Amendment, it's through the 14th Amendment, where it was stated that everything in the First Amendment now also applies to states. So that's where kind of the roots of free speech come from. So let's talk about speech and free speech in particular. And what is free speech? What is, and I'm going to use the term protected. What is protected free speech? Now, the term everything may not be the best word, but so many things are considered protected free speech. And I want to point out that in particular, some hate speech, what we would consider hate speech, the really derogatory, bias-infused, negative, rooted in historical stereotype, that kind of hate speech is oftentimes also included as protected free speech. Sometimes that's kind of hard to hear, and it's kind of hard to wrap your brain around. I get that often going, Dr. Kraut, really? Somebody can say this and it's okay? A lot of times, yes, it is okay. It's still protected free speech, even if it makes us uncomfortable or upset, that a lot of times that's still considered free speech, except or until, and this is where there's a line in the sand, it hits some other different categories, and that's known as unprotected speech, meaning there are implications, there are consequences for this type of speech. This is where it crosses the line, and it's not considered free speech anymore. One of those is true threat. Now, I'll get a lot from students that they hear a derogatory term and I feel threatened. What they may be feeling is upset, offended by that language, but a threat is actually specific, very much targeted towards you as an individual, and it's intended to be result in an, or there's a statement of an unlawful act of violence. That's the best way to kind of put it. So, for example, I can have a student or someone say to me, Dr. Kraut, you, and then insert derogatory language there. I may be offended by that and upset by that, but that still doesn't cross into a true threat. Now, if that same individual said, Dr. Kraut, you, and again, insert derogatory language there, I'm going to come over and beat you up, or I'm going to strike you, or I'm going to kill you, or something like that, that's when it hits into this true threat. It's very specifically aimed at me. It's implying an unlawful act of violence, and the hate speech that is infused in that shows the motivating factor for that individual acting that way. That's crossing a line, and that's a true threat. Similar with fighting words, it's when a person uses language to incite you to actual physical altercation, not necessarily a verbal altercation, but a physical altercation. Like they really want a physical interaction, a physical fight to result, and so they're going to goad you and use language in that way. That's crossing a line. Harassment. I also get quite often from students about, I feel harassed. Harassment, again, they might be actually, again, offended, feeling upset by that language, but harassment is a slightly different thing. It is, again, very specific. It's very targeted towards you as an individual. It is ongoing, or what they call pervasive, meaning it happens multiple times. When you think often of the term, you often hear harassment more in connection with sexual harassment. A lot of that is multiple times. You'll see this repetitive behavior of somebody doing something incredibly inappropriate of a sexual nature that is harassing and very targeted toward that individual. And so that's kind of the harassment piece. It can be a one-time event where it's severe, like just a really egregious act. So it doesn't always have to be repetitive. It can be that one time, but again, it's very specifically targeted towards you, it's kind of either constant or egregious, and it's in some ways intended to stifle you or hinder you as an individual. So a lot of times in an institution of higher education, when we're looking at whether or not a person has been harassed, we're also looking at, has the actions of that individual affected the recipient of those actions in such a way that they feel they can't even participate in their educational experience anymore. They don't feel they can go to class. They don't feel they can go to the dining hall. That's when it starts to cross the line with harassment. So that's a little bit about harassment. Some other areas of actions or speech that are unprotected, that kind of cross that line. An invasion of privacy. A lot of times, the most common college example that's out there recently is what they call revenge porn. It's when some compromising photos or videos have been taken during the course of a relationship, and when the relationship ends, then that video or picture is released by one party or the other, and that's considered an invasion of privacy. That's crossing the line and not necessarily free speech or protected. Obscenity. Now, a lot of times you can think of several things that might be obscene, but obscene is usually of a sexual nature in such an egregious fashion, but also put out in a way that has no what they call artistic or scientific merit. That there's no reason why this should be out there. It has no merit other than it's just nasty. It's just obscene. And that's when it kind of crosses the line. Defamation. I've also heard that term from students before, that they feel like when somebody has said something bad about them, that it is defamation. Defamation is actually a little different than that. It is a person saying something untrue about another person, but then it goes to a third party, oftentimes something that can be published. And then that third party doesn't check out the original report and goes ahead and publishes that information anyway, and then there's a negative consequence. So let me give you an example. So if somebody reported to the LASSO something untrue about me, and the LASSO did not double check to make sure that the information they had was accurate, and they published it, and then I lost my job, for example, or something terrible happened, then that would be a case of defamation. There's untruth, but then it heads to this third-party publication of some kind, and it can be social media publication as well. That person doesn't check out the information, and then there's a negative consequence to that. That's actually defamation. So there's a little bit more to it than just someone saying something bad about you. For higher ed, when free speech can cross the line is when it substantially disrupts or interferes with university operations. We're going to talk a little bit about that when we talk about student activism. Things like if you were to disrupt class, or if you were going to act in a way that would prevent somebody from being able to enter a building. Things like that could be crossing a line as well. Encouraging a crime or a lawless act. If someone is using their free speech or articulating views or values, and part of that is encouraging others to commit a crime or a lawless act, that's when it can also kind of go over a line. That the message is really inciting those to do something against the law. That's not quite good either. And finally, what is called a heckler's veto. Now, when we start to talk about activism and student activism and areas and spaces where that can happen, a lot of times you will have outdoor common spaces where you could have protests, and again, we'll mention that in a second. You can have protests and counter-protests and counter-protests. That's all fine. When you were to have an event in what they would call a limited public forum, for example, Margo Jones, you have to have a reservation to do a presentation or a speaker or something in Margo Jones, and that's usually a university event, or it could even be sponsored by student org, but you have to reserve the space there's an intent for that. If someone gets up and they heckle with the intent of trying to shut down that speaker, that is not considered free speech. That is actually stepping over a line. That's different than this idea of having protests and counter protests in an outdoor common space. This is actually trying to shut down someone's speech in a what would be a limited or reserved kind of public forum, and that is again kind of stepping over the line. So we have to watch that. I know that was really long, but I hope it gives you an idea of there are some ways, or there's some times when free speech isn't free speech anymore and crosses a line into unprotected speech. But really, then there's a lot of times when what you might think maybe shouldn't be or couldn't be, right? Free speech actually could be. Let's talk a little bit about Texas law. So at the last Texas legislative session, this year is actually a year of the Texas legislature meeting, so it was 2 years ago. They introduced what they called Senate Bill 18. And the intent was at the time, I think the concerns were that all voices on our college and university campuses were not heard. Some of that was much more based in this thought that maybe voices from a more conservative political standpoint were not being heard as opposed to other voices on the political spectrum. And that might have been where this kind of emanated. But in the end, what it really did was tell universities to let's find more ways and opportunities for freedom of speech to happen on your college campuses. So up until 2 years ago, we had a couple free speech zones. Dallas campus had one. We had a couple. One was right outside Brackenridge Hall here, and those were our free speech zones, just those two. And then we would have a free speech bulletin board where you could just anybody could put anything on a bulletin board, and we just have one. And that was kind of it. And now with SB 18, the idea is, no, you've got to open that up a lot more and think about free speech in a slightly different way. So in the end, it actually kind of broadened the opportunity for students to be able to express themselves. And I'm going to go into the next slide and kind of talk about some of those things. So like I said before we had a couple free speech zones. And now what we have in our new policy, which if you go online and read it, it is long and fairly comprehensive. So I'm going to abbreviate here. But now we have what we call outdoor common areas or / traditional public forums. Those areas are open to free speech gatherings, assemblies, protests, you name it. And I'll kind of talk about that a little bit more and maybe how to use those areas and where they exist. But there are a lot more of them. We have one policy now and encompasses a lot of different things. So if you've ever had questions about what's the posting policy on campus? Can I distribute literature or not? How do I put out signs or signage? And what does that look like? Our free speech policy includes all of those things. And I've had some recent questions on that from students. So just to lead you that way. There are some areas where the college can kind of say, or the university can kind of say, here's some parameters. And those are in time, what they call time, place, and manner. So we will have a lot of, you'll see outdoor common areas or traditional public forums offered to students, but there will be some places that are really not traditional public forums for our students. And that's something a university can do in order to make sure that their functions, which are classes, university events, etc., can continue to happen unhindered. So we have some caveats in there that in the free speech policy that kind of talk about that. And finally, the biggest piece is about content neutrality. Now, what does that mean? That means that a student org wants to bring a speaker on campus, and maybe their topic is not the most popular that's out there. They can still have that speaker on campus. There's nothing the institution can do or should do that would limit that opportunity. We have to approach everything from a content neutral standpoint. Another example might be with posting things on a bulletin board. If you were to go into Hubbard and want to post something on their public bulletin board, and you go down to Kyle's area in Center for Student Development and you get that stamp, it doesn't matter what the flyer says or the content of that flyer. We can't make a judgment on that. We can't refuse to allow you to post that because of the content of the flyer. So it can have all sorts of messages on there. And we have to, though, remain very content neutral. Of course, going back to some of the unprotected free speech things, there might be some things that cross the line. We wouldn't want someone to post something that says, Dr. Kraut, I'm going to hurt you. That would be, again, not protected speech. But if it's, for example, just kind of an unpopular sentiment, we have to be content neutral about a lot of those things.
Dr. Kraut, could I ask a question?
Yes.
If the student organization, say, brought a guest speaker on campus that was semi-controversial, can the official organization take a stand with particular maybe signage or posters endorsing that topic? Or would they need to leave that up to individual members of the organization to do so on their own time?
Run that past me again.
So let's say we have a Young Democrats organization, which I don't believe we do at this time. They wanted to bring a particular candidate to campus that's running for a local election, who maybe has said some things that have offended, say, the college Republican group. Can the Young Democrats take a stand and take an official stand and voice their opinion as an recognized organization of TWU? Or since they're an organization, should they stay content neutral and allow that message to be shared by individual members on their own time?
No. So, well, yes, the student org can take a stand and say whatever, because they're a student organization. When we talk content neutral, we're talking about when the university is having to make a decision on, again, somebody bringing a speaker on campus or posting something that in the lens we have to look at or look through when making that decision has to be content neutral. We can't say, well, we don't know that we agree with the content of this flyer, so we're not going to let you post it. We actually can't look at it that way. We are content neutral and would allow them to post that, unless, again, it kind of tipped the scales into this unprotected speech piece, which would get into threats and things like that. We, wouldn't want that. But by and large, yeah, you could have very interesting messaging from our student orgs or individual students that, even as a flyer that we'd still have to kind of stamp and let them post, because that it is not our role to judge the content.
Thank you.
It's much more of a university official kind of piece. But good question, yeah. So let's talk a little bit about outdoor common areas. And in my next slide, next two slides, I'll have a map and show you how many of them are out there. But the big piece is you do not have to have a reservation. You don't have to reserve those spaces. You can assemble, you can protest, you can gather in those spaces without a reservation. Okay, we do encourage reservations because the only time we would, or one of the few times we'd ever ask a group to move if they were assembling in an outdoor common area is if someone else already had it reserved. So the reservations do kind of take priority over the spontaneous. And that's why it's always good. Go ahead and reserve it. No harm, no foul. Just go ahead, and then that way you know it's there for you when you want it. But you don't have to. And there's no action the university would take against you if you just chose to assemble in that outdoor common area. That's okay, and you can do that. Now, public areas, gang, such as sidewalks, when we think like around a down, up and down Bell, all those are still always considered areas of free assembly. They are public areas. So when I show you the outdoor common areas, we're talking really about areas that are considered campus, but are areas where you can freely assemble without a reservation. So here's a map of our outdoor common areas, also known as traditional public forums. You can tell there's more than one or two now. They are all the way out to the golf course, Red Bund Lane, around Pioneer Woman, behind the dining hall, our university gardens. There are many of them. So these are all areas where you could assemble, you could protest, you could gather without a reservation. It's nice if you were to decide to reserve them, again, just to make sure nobody else has taken up your space. You can do that in EMS, that these are actually already labeled in EMS and reservable. But you can see there's a lot now, a lot of neat spaces that you could kind of make your own and do your own thing in if you chose to. So some basics. There are a lot of websites out there on college student activism. Some of them are absolutely wonderful in order to provide guidance and information and hints and tips and nuances to college students about how to be active, how to find out what interests you and what you're passionate about, and how to investigate the issues that have come to your attention that you'd like to learn more about, so you can decide how to take a stance on. Information about how to use social media wisely in being active and out there, especially your own individual social media. Sometimes when you use TWU social media, you need to be careful of your other expectations, especially if you're with particular academic programs who might have some professional standards regarding the use of social media. So watch how you use TWU accounts in that, and think about your academic programs and if there are any expectations there. But your own individual social media accounts and how you might be active on there, or thinking about how to be and how to exercise some social activism and how to bring people and groups together. So you can definitely do that using social media. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how to gather, since we've talked about these outdoor common spaces so much, about gathering and using your voice in some of those areas, and to feel free to do so. I mentioned kind of place, time, manner, and one of the big things is if you needed kind of how do I know when I should and shouldn't be doing something? First thing you can always think about, is this interfering with the functions of the institution? That's really the bottom line. If I ever get that question from students about, well, what can I not do? That's the line I lay out. Hey, as long as you're not interfering with the functions of the institution. So you need to think about, don't do anything that would block access from a building, so that somebody can't go in or can't go to class or can't go eat. You can definitely use your outdoor common space or your traditional public forum and gather and protest and assemble, but make sure that somebody could still enter that building. That's just being respectful and, again, not interfering with the functions. We wouldn't want to do anything that would disrupt class. And so one thing you might want to do if you're ever thinking about an assembly or a protest is go ahead and reserve that space and have a conversation. I'll talk about some great folks to have a conversation with when thinking about your event, because there might be times especially if you want to use amplified sound, and I'll mention that in a second, that you could be able to do it, but maybe there's some times when it wouldn't be good to do it because class is happening during that time. So trying to navigate that, but you wouldn't want to disrupt class. You wouldn't want to damage property. And that goes beyond what you think in terms of vandalism. Some of the things in our free speech policy that we talk about that allude to damaging property can include things like we really don't want you to tape or post things on the outside of buildings. That, you know, if you're going to have a lot of signage and you're thinking about maybe staking it into the ground, you might want to go ahead and do a reservation so that we know you're going to stake stuff into the ground, and want to make sure that that's not causing too much damage to our landscaping or our grass or our area. So little things like that to think about with damaging property. Not that that's to totally hold you back, but there's some things to think about, and maybe sometimes when you want to go and do that reservation just to make sure everything's good to go, right? Again, please consider reserving that space, but it is not required. Some other nuances, signs. So when you see a demonstration or a protest on TV, obviously a lot of signage, and we want to encourage signs. That's awesome. One of the things you'll see in the free speech policy, and it's in a lot of policies across the country and colleges and universities when talking about protests, is signs are great, don't put them on sticks. I know that gives you all sorts of height and everybody can see what your sign has to say. They often wind up being used as ways to hit somebody, unfortunately. And so that's one of the time, place, manner pieces of the policy. Signs are great, don't put them on sticks. Amplified noise. If you're going to do something more than what would be like a bullhorn or just shouting, and you need a amplified sound system, or you're thinking of an amplified sound system, that's also a good time when you want to be able to reserve the space and get approval for that amplified sound system. That way we know there's no disruption of the classes or what's going on at the institution. You've dotted your I's, crossed your T's. You can go ahead and go about your event with your amplified sound, but that's when you'd want to get a reservation, make sure everything is good to go and you can use that amplified sound. I oftentimes get questions about DPS and security, and a couple different kinds of questions. One of them is, will we have to pay for security? Something that is new with this free speech policy, or a new development in our process, is that we've realized as an institution that we will have to figure out a way to cover our DPS or security costs and not pass that on to a student or a student org, who often don't have the means to be able to pay for that. The right to assemble, the right to kind of protest is just something that we have to accommodate, need to accommodate, should accommodate on our campus. And if that means we need to provide additional security or DPS so that our students are safe during those particular activities, as an institution, we have to find a way to handle that cost, and we will not be passing it on to students or student orgs. If it's an outside entity that was coming on campus for some reason to protest, a lot of times we would have to pass that cost on to them, but that is not true when it comes to if a student were to host something or a student org were to host something. We'll just have to figure that out. And I know that's a little different than how we've handled things before, but I hope that's reassuring for a student or a student org. The other question I often get with DPS and security is, what role would they play? And that's a very current question, given what's going on outside in the rest of society. And so the role of our DPS during any type of protest or assembly is just to make sure our students are safe. So very peripheral, not with the intent to engage our students unless, again, it looked like someone was potentially going to be harmed, someone was in danger, somebody was not in a safe situation. Most of the time, what students should expect is if somebody needs addressed during a protest for something small, say, for example, somebody has a sign that has a stick, right? Then chances are you would get addressed more from somebody like me who would go up and ask you to please take the stick off of the sign and let you go on with your event and enjoy your moment. But that would probably be the extent of it. That is not how our DPS is going to function in these. We really want their function to be about making sure that our students are safe. So I think that's something you can kind of expect and kind of count on. A lot of times when students do hold protests on our campus, it's not very often. Maybe that'll increase with the current election, for example. But a lot of times protests that might start here tend to go down to the square in Denton. A lot of them kind of head that direction because it's usually the protest itself might have started as a bigger collective effort, sometimes with UNT or with the city of Denton. So another thing that our DPS officers would do is they might kind of hang out down Bell Avenue, because even though the sidewalk along Bell is public, Bell can be a really busy thoroughfare, and the people who might travel up and down Bell may not be as supportive to what's going on as they could be. So again, we want to make sure our students are safe. So I hope that kind of helped answer some questions about DPS and their various roles and where that they kind of fit in this process. I know I've had some questions on that. So that's a lot, and I really appreciate everyone's time as you kind of listened in. We have some resources. We have a new page on our free speech policy on the civility webpage, and the link is right here. You will find the map of the outdoor common areas that I shared with you, along with a lot of other information about free speech in general and some activism hints and tips there too. If you ever run into a situation where you really feel your free speech has been violated, that someone has crossed that line into that unprotected free speech, again, you're feeling threatened or you're feeling harassed, or you know, the whole fighting words piece, or whatever, you just think somebody's crossed a line, we have an incident report. It's actually, we have a couple different ones. One, it could be just reporting an incident, and that would be about a violation of student code of conduct. The other thing is we have an acts of intolerance form, which is a bias reporting form, and we always follow up with incidents if students submit a particular situation. We follow up with that student if they so wish and help try and address that situation as well. So there's a couple different mechanisms for you. If you have any additional questions, and it is perfectly fine if you do, if you intend to put together an event and you just want to run some ideas past somebody, you want to make sure everything's good to go, that you've thought of everything, you want to make sure the people who participate are safe, but you want people to be able to participate, you know, and you just need to talk through some things with someone. There are a lot of resources on our campus. I've put my information up there. Please feel free to contact me and set up an appointment. We can walk through your planned event and see that everything's good to go. I've had a couple different emails even in the last 2 weeks with some questions on some different types of ways they would like to assemble or find their voice, use their voice on campus, and I've been happy to help with that. Of course, Kyle and his crew at the Center for Student Development are great resources if you're trying to think about how to put together an event, how to do it safely, what you might need to do, what you may not need to worry about. Sometimes you could go to the Department of Public Safety. We have definitely had students reach out to Chief Garrison and ask questions, especially when they're talking about walking down Bell and talking through some concerns and seeing how DPS can be supported. And then of course the student union. If you're going to reserve a space, an outdoor common space, they can be very helpful with that process and some other questions that you might have about putting together an event. So that's a little bit about free speech and student activism, maybe a little bit more than you ever wanted to know, but I hope that it kind of generated some ideas, maybe answered some questions or addressed some concerns for you so that you know that there are opportunities for you to use your voice on this campus. And we want you to feel like you can do that and that you are part of an institution that you can trust to reach out to people and say, we'd like to do this. And I could use some help, and how can we make this work? And know that you'd be supported in those actions. I know that sometimes people get very concerned if they're going to put together a protest or assemble. They worry about the reaction of others to that. But that's part of, those concerns are the reason kind of why we're here. We want to help alleviate those. We want to help make sure that if others do have any other concerns, that we can also alleviate those concerns so you can go about having the event that you want to have. There is a civic engagement task force on our campus, and we have several events coming up. I just wanted to end with that. You can see a walk to the polls. We do have a great skills for civil discourse session with the Center for Politics and Public Policy through an organization called Braver Angels. And I know sometimes it's very tough to have conversations where people are coming from very different viewpoints. And so we're trying to help our students find ways where they can comfortably do that, because it's great energy when you have great dialogue. We are planning some post-election events. We hope to have a moment of unity on the day after the event, so no matter the outcome, we can come together as pioneers. We are going to have an Unpacking the Election event, kind of talk through the nuances of the election, no matter how it ends, and give some perspective and some insight, and help normalize some of the reactions to that. And then finally, DIO is also going to sponsor a culture talk on the elections on November 10th. So a lot going on during the month, during the early part of November, especially as we wrap up our election period. So for anybody, if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them. If not, again, thank you so much for your time. I hope this gives you some great information, and also gives you some folks that you can follow up with if you have any questions later. And thank you, SGA, for sponsoring me.
Of course. Thank you so much, Dr. Krapp.